Hello everybody, hope you can hear me. Welcome to this Island Plan Review webinar session. Today's session is focusing on minerals, waste and utilities. So I think we may have some other people joining us, but I'll kick off before we get into the detail of the session today, just to run through some of the house rules that we're operating for these webinars. First of all, just to make people aware that depending on how you've joined the session, some of your contact details might be available. If you don't want them to be available, then and the session is being recorded, so please leave the call, and you can then watch the recording when that's posted online. In terms of how we'll run the session, we will provide opportunities for questions. So please use your hand function on your toolbar if you want to raise a question. I'll pause at various points during the presentation to take questions. We can also use the respond to any queries posted in the chat function. So please also use that if you wish. So that's the house rules for the session. On the call today, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Kevin Pilley. I'm from the Island Plan Review team. I've also got my colleague Alistair Coates, who's from the Island Plan Review team, from working in this area of the plan, and Alistair will be picking up any queries that come through the chat or joining in any discussion. So that's the setup and process for the session today. The areas that we want to cover are set out on the slide. So just some introductory material about the consultation process on the draft plan, quick overview of the draft plan itself, and then we'll start to get into the meat of the issue today, looking at the strategic context and policies for minerals, waste and utilities, and then dipping into the detailed policies themselves, and then rounding up just with a reminder about how people can engage in the consultation process. So in terms of the consultation phase of the plan itself, draft plan was released on the 19th of April. It was a 3-month consultation period closing on the 12th of July. We would encourage people to engage through the consultation portal. If people do want to make representation in relation to the plan, we need to receive that in writing. And as I say, we'd encourage people to register that through the portal. We can take comment in other forms, provided it's written, so hard copy or email also accepted. In terms of the consultation process, or the process that's remaining in terms of the approval of the plan, we're obviously a consultation phase at the moment. Once the consultation phase closes on the 12th of July, then all of the representations that have been received will be considered by the Minister for the Environment. I should also add that this phase of the consultation is also open to states members to lodge amendments in relation to the draft plan. So they are also running to the same time scale that public consultation is operating under. So the Minister will consider all amendments made by states members together with representations, and he will publish his initial view in relation to those. All of that material will then be considered by independent planning inspectors, who will look across all of the representations and the amendments to identify those issues of most contention, and they will hold then a public examination into those key issues, and may invite parties who've made representations or amendments to participate in that, to explore issues in greater detail. They will then produce a report. The inquiry itself is envisaged taking place in October, November of this year. So we expect to receive their report towards the back end of 2021 or beginning of 2022. That will be published, and the Minister will then consider the inspector's recommendations. There's a window of opportunity for states members to lodge amendments in relation to the issues raised by the inspector, and also an ability for the Minister himself to respond to inspector's recommendations with potential amendments to the plan. All of that is then considered by the States Assembly, who will be sitting in March of next year to consider the approval of the plan. So that's the timeline. In terms of the consultation phase that we are running at the moment, as I say, that runs until the 12th of July, but we are doing some active consultation and engagement throughout May and into June. See, this webinar is one of a series. There's a couple more to run next week on thematic elements of the plan. Those that have happened already are available online, or if they're not there now, will be shortly. And so you can look at previous content also. Following today's session, we are offering a planner surgery if there are detailed issues that you want to discuss in more depth with a member of the Island Plan Review team, and we'll send a link to participate in that at the end of the session today if you want to book a slot with one of us to discuss any issues. We're also visiting parish halls, and we've got a session in St Mary's this evening, 4 till 7, Grooville tomorrow, and Trinity on Saturday. So those are the remaining public events for consultation. In terms of the draft plan itself, the plan comprises both the written statement together with a series of proposals maps. They're at an island-wide scale, showing all of the planning zones together with flood risk, and the same is then replicated for a more detailed inset map for town, so planning zones and flood risk. The structure of the plan is similar to the current island plan, with a few notable additions. So divided into 4 volumes. The first 2 volumes are strategic in nature, with a set of strategic proposals, some strategic policies, together with a new section which provides a focus on some of the different places in the island. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but essentially we've introduced a settlement hierarchy, and there's a suite of policies that provide a policy framework for each of those places in the settlement hierarchy, which sets out the level of development that might be expected over the planned period. Whilst that's focused on the urban environment, there's also a places section relating to the coast, countryside, and the marine environment, which has got particular relevance to some of the things that we'll touch on today. The section 3 of the plan, volume 3, is the main meat of the plan, where all of the detailed policies are set out around a series of themes. And again, we'll have a particular focus on some of those today. In terms of how the plan ought to be used, policies should not be considered in isolation. You need to have regard to the entirety of the plan itself. So that includes the strategic policies in that places section that I just made reference to, together with the strategic context. Supporting the preparation of the draft plan is a series of evidence-based reports, which at the scoping of the draft plan, we identified a range of areas where additional information was required, or existing information needed to be refreshed. And that's of particular relevance to what we're going to cover today. So I'll highlight some of the key parts of the evidence base that support some of the policies relating to minerals, waste, and utilities a bit later. Obviously, today's focus is going to be around the thematic part of the plan, dealing with minerals extraction and solid waste disposal, also talking about utilities and strategic infrastructure. And as I said at the outset, we'll pick up the relevance of some of the strategic policies and places section of the plan, also just to signpost those to you. So that was by way of introduction. I don't know if there's any queries arising in relation to that. If not, I'll press on. In terms of the policies that are set out in the plan, as we run through the presentation, we've just sought to annotate where policies are new or have undergone significant change, or have simply just been revised in terms of some of the nature of the wording, but reflecting the strategic direction of the current island plan, just as an aid memoir, really. So if you're wondering what the symbols are as we run through the policies, this is what they mean. I talked about evidence base. There are two key reports to this aspect of the plan. The first of these is a study that was commissioned through ARAP, dealing with minerals, waste and water. So this provides a strategic overview of the island's current position in terms of supply of minerals, dealing how we deal with inert waste, and also the issue of potable water supply for the island. So some work was done to look at a baseline in relation to into that, and then to look at how the plan might respond to deal with future requirements in relation to all of these aspects. And that was done through the creation of a series of scenarios, and where various options were explored and tested, and out of that, a series of conclusions and recommendations were made, and that's informed the preparation of the draft plan. So it's worth having a look at that piece of the evidence base if you haven't already done so. In addition to that, we've also done some work to look at the infrastructure capacity of the island. So similar in terms of its format and scoping to the minerals work. So really an assessment of a baselining sort of state of the nation report as to the condition and state and capacity of the island's infrastructure, both hard and soft infrastructure, and then looking at what sort of challenges lie ahead in terms of future infrastructure provision. So again, another part of the evidence base of particular relevance to what we're going to be covering today. All of that material is available online as part of the core evidence base supporting the draft island plan. In terms of the strategic policies, clearly a range of those, and I just wanted to highlight three in particular. So they've got particular relevance to the subject of today's session. First of all, the spatial strategy of the plan, which sets out how we should, or where we should meet most of the island's development needs across the plan period. Whilst the strategy focuses most development activity within the island's built-up area, there is recognition that some activities have specific locational requirements, and there is explicit recognition of that in the plan and in both the spatial strategy and the related places section of the plan, specifically PL5, which deals with countryside, coast and marine environments. So thinking particularly around minerals and provision of some bits of infrastructure requirements that can't be met or, within the built-up area. So that's explicitly recognised in the policy framework of the plan. A couple of other strategic policies that touch on these areas, and just a recognition that these aspects of island life have key relevance for both the economy and the community. So thinking specifically of things like provision of minerals to and aggregates to support the island's construction industry, which is obviously seeking to respond to community requirements, particularly for homes and various other bits of community infrastructure, and likewise supporting the development of new buildings to support the island's economy. But also just in terms of the provision of strategic infrastructure, again, both with economic and community significance. So that was just a brief overview of some of the strategic framing for the more detailed policies. Don't know if any questions on that. If not, I'll press on to the detail of the thematic policies in the plan. Split these in two to deal with minerals and solid waste first, and then we'll cover utilities and strategic infrastructure secondly. So in terms of minerals extraction and solid waste disposal, three key policies of the plan, dealing with provision of minerals, safeguarding waste sites, and then a policy to deal with new, extended or existing waste management sites. If we start with minerals, and it's worth just taking some time to consider the context for the preparation of draft policy in the plan. So as I mentioned earlier, the sourcing of aggregates clearly important for the island's development industry to meet a whole range of needs, as I mentioned earlier. In terms of the local manifestation of that, that's really around crushed rock and sand. In terms of the supply to the construction industry. In terms of the existing island plan, that was informed by the preparation of a mineral strategy, which was undertaken in the late 90s, and looked to ensure a supply of minerals to the island over a 20-year period, and that's been reflected, or that's informed successive island plans from 2002 and 2011. When we were scoping out the draft plans, clearly a requirement to revisit and refresh that policy framework now that it's coming to the end of its life, and so the draft plan seeks to do that, and that's why we commissioned that specific study looking at minerals waste and water. In that piece of work, we're looking at how we might secure long-term supply of minerals to the island, and that's informed the draft policies set out in the plan. The work that was done was different in nature to the previous mineral strategy, in that it was broader, in that it considered not only minerals but also sort of primary aggregate market, but also the secondary aggregate market, which the work has revealed is particularly significant in Jersey, in that about 40% of our annual aggregate supply is derived from recycled products. And so what we're looking to secure is a more integrated approach to the management of waste arisings, and the potential for that to be recycled and plugged back into the construction industry, because clearly that's got a linkage to the longevity and sustainability of our primary aggregate supply. So we're looking for that integration through the policy framework that's set out in the plan, and of course the aggregate market that operates on the island. The issue of water was considered within this mix as well, largely around the competing interests, if you like, over use of holes in the ground in the island for either mineral extraction, waste management and disposal, and also potential water storage. So the study that was undertaken looked at the strategic options available to deal with all of those particular challenges for Jersey. When we look at minerals, we obviously focused on establishing what the situation was with existing operators in the island, looking at their existing operations and their existing capacity. In doing that, some work was done to look at what demand might look like in the future, and that's set out in the report. Clearly, when we embarked on the island plan review, we were looking at a 10-year review of the plan. That was subsequently changed to a shorter-term bridging island plan because of the impact of Brexit and COVID. But I think this work still stands us in reasonable stead in terms of looking to secure a long-term supply of aggregate for the island. So in terms of the current baseline, as set out in the report, we've got three key operators in the island in terms of supply of minerals derived from Rhone Quarry, granite products at Le Gigolon, and then Simon Sand and gravel operating in St Juan's Bay. Some detail provided around their average annual output, together with an assessment of their potential winnable reserves from within the boundaries of their existing sites. And you can see in terms of securing a long-term supply at the individual quarries, there's some challenges in relation to both Rhone and granite products, and also in terms of sand supply from Simul, all quite limited in the duration. So, as I said, the minerals waste and water study looked to establish that baseline position and then to test a range of scenarios to enable us to explore the strategic options that were available to the island to best meet our needs across both minerals waste and water supply. And those scenario testing options were comprehensive, so they didn't just look at perpetuating the existing situation. Consideration was given to looking at external sources of supply and considering the implications that would present. So each of those options was assessed against a range of criteria, and you can see all the detailed analysis of that as set out in the report. So that provides a bit of the background to the policy framework that is now manifest in the draft plan. In terms of mineral supply, that's set out at policy MW1, which deals with the overarching supply of minerals for the island. And I've just sought to focus on the individual sites and to look at the policy regime that's presented in the draft plan in relation to them specifically. So firstly, taking Rhone Quarry, it's safeguarded in the draft plan as a mineral extraction site, and the principle of extension to the quarry is supported in the draft plan. I should add that the previous mineral strategy and the current island plan essentially supports that position. So in terms of a significant change to policy, that's not particularly significant. And indeed, Rhone have got a current application lodged with the department to consider that extension to the quarry. In terms of Le Gigolon, as I mentioned earlier, the based on the information derived from the baseline assessment and looking at forecasts for future demand. There is a challenge around the long-term supply of aggregates from the site, and as part of the work to consider the strategic options, the recommendation emerging in terms of the future of the Gigalong, the recommendation was that the principle of extension to the quarry is supported to identify and support a longer-term supply of aggregates from this existing operation. So to do that would require an extension of the quarry to the south of the site, taking field 966 in St Mary's to source that additional stream of aggregate supply. In terms of what the draft plan is doing, it's proposing that be the principle of extending the quarry be endorsed through the approval of the draft plan. That itself would be subject to more detailed environmental impact assessment and the preparation of a restoration plan, and that would be tested through the normal planning process. So essentially the plan is seeking to establish the principle of extending the quarry, but any environmental implications associated with that would be addressed through the normal planning process. And then in terms of Simul sand, Simul sand in the current island plan, informed by the existing mineral strategy, was envisaged that it would close in 2018, so that it would cease as a source of local sand supply. Now, during the plan period of the current island plan, the rates of extraction from Simul have been lower than anticipated at the time of the approval of the 2011 island plan, which has meant that the winnable reserves within the boundary of the existing site remain to be extracted, if you like. So there was an application made to extend the lifetime of the quarry up to 2023, but within the existing boundaries of the site. So that consent has been granted. So the quarry's lifetime is extended to 2023. In terms of the work that was done through the Minerals Waste and Water study to look at the options for provision of supply of sand to the island, the various options were considered in relation to that, including potential extension to Simul sand and carrying the extraction of sand on further into the bay. But the view taken is, because of that long-standing view that the operation would cease, and that there exists the potential for alternative sources of supply of sand, whether derived from the recycling of other aggregate products, or through some form of importation of sand through the port of St Helier, that was a preferable option, and that's the option that's been presented in the draft plan. The existing planning consent for the site comes with conditions attached to it, requiring the restoration of the site at Simul sand. That's the subject of active consideration under the terms of the existing planning consent, in terms of how that might be done and what form that might take. So the draft plan doesn't set out any view on that, and that it'll be dealt with under the terms of the existing planning consent. So that's the situation with mineral extraction. In terms of waste management and disposal, the island plan as I said earlier, seeks to recognise the significance of the secondary aggregate market for the island, and seeks to identify and safeguard those sites that currently perform that function, and ensure that the supply of secondary aggregates onto the local market is available. So the plan has sought to identify those sites with existing consents and operations to perform that function, and those are identified on the slide. So La Collette and Le Gigoland have got consent for both waste management and disposal, and then Broadlands at Morphallo in St Peter and the Barrett site both have consents relating to waste management. So they've got a policy regime now that seeks to protect them in that use. And then the plan recognises that, or seeks to provide a framework against which any proposals for new, extended, existing sites might be considered, just to ensure that there's some tests against which any such proposals might be addressed. So that's the summary of or signposting to the key elements of the minerals side of the plan. So I will pause at that stage to see if there are any questions. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand. I can see Mike.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks. Yeah.
Hello, Mike.
I was looking. I see that MW1, I think, is quite heavily linked to NE3 in the new plan. A couple of us affected quite heavily by NE3 with its Coast National Park implications.
Yep.
I think NE3 kind of replaces, in the new plan, replaces old NE6. Now, old NE6 was very prescriptive in several points, each 7, 8, 9, 10 elements, each with A, B, C, D, and several bullet points. So it's very prescriptive. So the question is whether the brevity of NE3 is helpful in terms of opening a completely open debate on these issues, or whether it actually closes the debate down in terms of having less prescribed elements that that NE6 can be judged against. Was there a conscious decision in making? First, I suppose the question is, am I right that NE3 does link to the old and new NE3 does link to old NE6? And secondly, the question is, was there a conscious decision to condense NE3 to be less prescriptive?
Yeah, I mean, you're right in terms of your observation. So essentially, this draft plan sets out a new approach to how we deal with effectively development in the around the coast and in the countryside. And for those of you who are familiar with the current plan, NE6 and NE7 deal with Green Zone and Coastal National Park. And at the moment in the current plan, they're both a mixture of, they've got spatial, if I can describe it as both spatial elements and thematic elements built into the same policy, as a consequence of which the policy runs to, goes over a couple of pages, and as part of the review of the island plan, we've been engaging with colleagues in development control, also with some of those in the development industry who use the plan regularly, together with decision makers. And there was I suppose an attempt to try and to some extent unpack that policy, and to take both the spatial and the thematic elements and effectively to separate them into more discrete policy areas. So I think you're right in what you say, in that has been disaggregated. So the landscape impact test that was previously in the Coastal National Park and the Green Zone policy has now been effectively disaggregated and given its own home in NE3, which is a test of impact on landscape and seascape character. But what I would say is that the other sort of spatial elements of that, the current policies are manifest in the the recognition that in both the places policies in the plan, recognizing that some activity will take place where it has specific locational requirements. So, clearly in terms of a minerals operation, that will take place where the minerals are, and so it seeks to give explicit recognition to that. So I don't know if that helps to answer your question. I mean, in terms of I suppose in terms of the NE3 itself, the landscape and seascape character, part of the work that we did to prepare the evidence base for the plan was to refresh the previous countryside character appraisal of the island. That's been replaced with an integrated landscape and seascape character assessment to provide us with more up-to-date and comprehensive evidence about the character of the island's countryside, but also this time an explicit decision was made to embrace seascape and to consider the relationship between development on the island that got an impact both on the island itself, but also around the coast and from the marine environment as well. So the evidence base is refreshed, and so that should provide a key tool in how NE3 is used and applied.
Yeah, thanks. And NE3 does indeed link quite clearly to MW1, doesn't it, through the need argument?
Yeah.
It accepts the need argument, and the need argument is made in MW1, so it still does link. Yeah, thank you very much, Kevin.
That's right, and it's just then about mitigating, managing landscape impact through the application of NE3, but recognising that things like minerals extraction does need to take place where the minerals are. Okay, I don't know if any other queries in relation to that. If not, I'll move on to the next section. So this next section considers the policy framework for utilities and strategic infrastructure. I would add that there are some elements of strategic infrastructure that do have their own specific provision, policy provision. I'm thinking specifically in relation to the hospital project, which has its own policy regime that's provided for it in the community infrastructure section of the plan. And the reason why I raised that, I suppose, is that the infrastructure capacity study provides us with that baseline understanding of what the island's infrastructure requirements are, in some instances, those requirements may be quite long term, and clearly we're dealing with a short term bridging plan. So, in some senses, the specific requirement for the needs for particularly bits of strategic infrastructure over the short term aren't either clear or specified at the moment. And so where that is the case, the plan doesn't make specific provision for those areas, but provides more of an enabling policy framework, which I'll touch upon in a minute. What we do have in the plan is a strategic proposal at the front of the plan, and the distinction between strategic proposals and proposals as they set out in the plan is that strategic proposals are things that are deemed to be something that was of greater priority that needs to be tackled over the period of the bridging plan, and it may also involve ministers outside of the environment portfolio, and I think there's an explicit recognition here that the island, the government in particular, needs to have a more comprehensive view about the island's requirements for infrastructure in a more sort of coordinated and integrated way. So there's a proposal to develop an infrastructure roadmap using the infrastructure capacity as that baselining tool to look at what the island's longer term requirements might be for key bits of infrastructure. But as I mentioned, there is a policy framework in the plan which seeks to enable the plan to deal with anything that did arise during the plan period, and just to provide some tests against which anything that arises during the plan period could be considered against. As I say, the maturity of the island in being able to plan for its infrastructure provision in a more comprehensive way is not as good as it perhaps might be, which is why there's this explicit recognition in the plan. And we can think of examples during the lifetime of the current plan, 2011 Island Plan, where we've seen things like the Kenove School, and see previous proposals for the hospital emerge during the plan period that weren't made explicit provision for in the 2011 plan. So we're seeking to ensure that we undertake some more detailed work during the short-term bridging plan period. So when the island plan is reset in 2025, we can make the necessary provision for sort of medium and long-term bits of kit that might have been identified from that work. So that's the sort of strategic policy, strategic infrastructure policy framework. This one is really acknowledging that there are some existing infrastructure facilities there that may need to be enhanced, or again, there might be provision to renew some of that kit. So again, a non-specific site-based policy, but again, just a sort of framework against which things can be tested. The essential focus of this is to focus the delivery of that infrastructure where possible, either within the existing built-up area or onto existing infrastructure sites, but recognising that there may be a requirement to deliver that outside of the built-up area. And again, some tests against which that can be considered. So where, if and where proposals emerge, they would need to demonstrate that there is a requirement, and that there is, or there has been, examination of reasonable alternatives to deliver the services that are required. And likewise, the plan seeks to safeguard existing infrastructure and utility provision. Moving now specifically on to water, I mentioned that the evidence base specifically considered the issue of water, and indeed Jersey Water have provided some evidence in the process, in the period leading up to the preparation of the draft plan, around some of the challenges that are specifically faced in terms of the provision of a water supply for the island. And essentially what that does is it acknowledges that we've got some existing challenges, and we need to be able to respond to those in terms of the that particular challenge for the island community. Clearly, when we've had to deal with these issues in the past, they've taken some considerable time between recognition of an issue and then delivery of a response. So there is a recognition that there's a challenge that exists now, and that's going to be exacerbated by issues associated with both climate change and any potential future population increase in the island. Because we are in this position of being in a bridging plan scenario with a short-term plan period, there is a proposal that's set out in the island plan, which talks about some additional work that ought to be undertaken during the plan period, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But the policy position adopted in the draft plan is that we recognise that there might be some requirements to increase the capacity of existing infrastructure, and that's allowed for within the policy regime that I've just touched on, and also a need to look more closely at how we can better manage demand. One of the issues that was raised and considered in the minerals waste and water study was the potential use of some of those holes in the ground that I talked about as potential water storage facilities, specifically Le Gigoland quarry. That's something that Jersey Water specifically raised during the strategic issues and options consultation. As part of the work to assess strategic options for the island, looking at across both minerals, waste and water, the recommendation was made that Le Gigoland did not best, or its use as a water storage reservoir did not best meet the island's strategic needs, on the basis that clearly it's an existing quarry and has significance as a potential future supply of aggregates to the island. It's also got existing consent for waste management and disposal, which is another strategic challenge for the island. And there exists the potential for other options to meet water storage challenges in that exist in the island. So that was the conclusion arising from the minerals waste and water study, and that's been reflected in the draft plan. As I said, however, there is an explicit recognition made of the fact that there does need to be a policy response to the challenges that are faced both by Jersey Water and the island, to look at how we can respond to the challenge of meeting demand for water over the coming years. So there is a proposal in the plan to do some more detailed work with Jersey Water over the bridging plan period to look at the options that might be available to deal with both demand management, but also the potential for infrastructure enhancement or provision. And then anything arising from that would then be reflected in the subsequent island plan review. Related to that is a policy in the plan picking up on that notion of demand management, and explicit policy provision in the draft plan seeking to ensure that we promote water conservation and management measures in new developments, and that's subject to a threshold in the plan. So anything over 200 square metres or a development involving 5 or more homes will need to demonstrate how they're conserving water. The last element of infrastructure that we're going to touch on is just around telecommunications. Clearly a significant growth in telecommunications provision over the current plan period, and we've seen a sort of plethora of masts pop up as use of mobile phones and mobile technology has grown. The island's obviously quite well served in terms of 4G, potential for 5G to emerge in the not too distant future. More widely is something that we need to make provision for. So the policy framework provided by the draft plan is not dissimilar to that which currently exists in the current island plan, but there is this recognition again that additional work needs to be done between the Environment Minister and the Minister for Economic Development to look at how we can arrive at a position where there are incentives and arrangements outside of the planning process that work with the planning system to ensure that we optimise things like mast sharing and network sharing across the island from a planning perspective. That would then seek to reduce the sort of potential visual impact of a wider plethora of kit spread around the island. Also looking at how we might change the planning legislation to deal more efficiently with some changes to enhance existing kit, and also some guidance about how to manage the visual impacts of that. So that was it in terms of content. I don't know if there were any queries around the utility infrastructure elements of policy. I can see Mark with his hand raised. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for that. Yeah, we're pleased to see a policy response to the water scarcity issues in Jersey. Just a query with relation, I know it's not part of this webinar, but about the potential for new homes in Jersey, and whether it's the intent that all the new home sites identified will have mains water provided, and whether that's a consideration in the choosing of locations of those sites, and how that might be set against the policy that you mentioned before, is it UL3, about the efficiency of those homes and so on, and the amount of water.
Yeah, we would expect all new homes to be connected to the main supply, and you know, the distribution of development across the island was touched on when we talked about the spatial strategy. So essentially, the housing delivery seeks to follow that. So most of the focus of the plan seeks to make provision for just over 4,000 homes. Most of that provision is envisaged being made within the existing built-up area, principally focused on St Helier. There is a proposal in the plan to release greenfield sites to provide about 400, between 400 450 homes. They're distributed across the island, but again, most of them are extensions to existing. Well, all of them are extensions to existing built-up areas. So, as part of that, the assessment of the location of those sites, issues of infrastructure supply and drainage issues would be part of that consideration. I don't know if that answers your
Great.
question.
I think that I think the location of those is obviously key for the provision of mains water, but the fact that they are identified as being close to existing developments probably makes life a bit easier in that regard. So thanks, Kevin.
Sure. And I suppose we've got a session next week where we're talking about managing environmental risks. So that covers things like the water catchment area, and the seeking to ensure that any development that comes forward in those areas is appropriately connected to water supply. There is some provision for exceptions to be made to also connection to drainage, but also there's some to mains drainage. There are some exceptions that are allowed, but only where there's confidence that wouldn't result in any issues for the island's water supply. I can see another hand. Sorry, I don't know whose hand it is other than SOS Jersey, so apologies.
Hi, Kevin. Can
Hi.
you hear me, Kev?
Yeah, I can hear you.
It's Dave Cavalry.
Oh, hello. Hi, Dave.
Hi there. I listened to the earlier minerals waste management, and I didn't ask a question then because I thought you'd perhaps move on to minerals, waste management of contaminated material, which is in our area and we follow very closely.
Sure.
We met with SOJDC last week on a similar sort of webinar, and it wasn't really a webinar, it was more of a meeting. And we went through the new waterfront proposals that they would like to follow if possible, which include 405 homes and so forth. Where we are, and with the questions we'd like to ask, are these really, that has anybody, because SOJDC hadn't at that time calculated the volume of contaminated waste that is likely to be removed from the waterfront development if it is allowed to go ahead as it is envisaged. As you know, the contaminated material across the waterfront is to different degrees, contaminated to different degrees, but going on a percentage volume, has the department worked out the likely volume that's going to be necessary to excavate and move to La Collette? And if so, where is it going to be put? How many pits would it go into? Is there any more room for pits? And how much the pits would cost? You intending on superfilling these pits? In other words, is it actually possible to do this? And what are the risk mitigations that have been put in place in the Allen plan insofar as forward planning for all this? Because it's very important. We've just brought out a 10-year study which actually covers over 20 years of our work, which is on our website. If you want to have a look at it, if you haven't already, I did actually send it to the officers. And we've already encountered problems with heavy metal leakage and impacts upon our shellfish as a result of historical, either leakage off the waterfront directly or leakage from the older ash pits at La Collette. And what we'd like to find, we'd like to actually have some sort of policy ingrained and encapsulated in the island plan to mitigate any future removal of these contaminated materials as and when they become a problem or removed. And I wonder whether or not because none of this waste minerals plan you've just presented very kindly to us doesn't cover that area. And I wonder whether it's going to be in a future environmental risks webinar, or whether or not the two things could be linked, or whether what you intended to do about it within the island plan. That's my question.
Okay. Well, I suppose the short answer to your question is we have got a webinar next week which will cover the areas of managing waste and environmental risk. Apologies if you've attended this one with the expectation that those are the areas that we would cover.
Sorry, that's what I'll obviously attend the other one. When's the other one? Because I have to be
the other one's on Tuesday, I think. So similar time, 12:30 on Tuesday, I believe. So we will specifically look at that's right, yeah, look at the policy regime that covers those areas. But I suppose in a sort of longer answer, the plan, the island plan, won't deal with some of the detail that you talked about there. What the island plan will do, it will consider the at a strategic level the options that the island's got in terms of dealing with waste. And so we did cover some of that in this session, in that we identify those sites that have got existing consents for waste management and disposal. So, from an island plan point of view, we seek to identify and safeguard those sites for continued use for that operation. I think some of the issues that you are raising are really around the sort of regulation of those activities. Once they've got planning consent. So the island plan won't deal with the sort of detailed issues that you identified. In terms of the issues that we will cover next week, we'll talk about the suite of policies that seeks to deal with the implications of developments, both in terms of generating waste and generating sort of potential harm, but then also the policy regime that's there to safeguard the island and islanders from the implications of environmental risk. So that's what we'll cover next week.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Just one point that you probably will know, or you can help us with, so we can take it away to before then. You must have some idea of the actual capacity of La Collette at its present time, if it's to take not just aggregate, but inert aggregate, but contaminated waste. We must have some idea of the capacity before, there must be some overall, how many thousand cubic meters of contaminated waste can be buried before La Collette cannot take anymore, and so on and so forth. Have you got any advanced information of that for us to think about?
Yeah, I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but if you look at the minerals waste and water study, there is some work that's set out there in terms of the baseline, looking at the capacity of Le Collet. I mean, I think the short answer is that Le Collet has a quite a short-term life in terms of the existing capacity of the current facility. There is potential to mine some of the existing fill and to extract some value from some of the existing fill, which would both provide some secondary aggregates back onto the market, but would also have the potential to extend the life of the facility there. But the island plan seeks to identify other opportunities for waste management and disposal, and as I mentioned, places like Le Gigolon have got an existing consent to do that, so there are some options available for the island to to deal with its waste arisings, and that's what the plan is seeking to make provision for.
Okay, just one final question. When will the collet actually be full? What in terms of years?
Like I say, I think you'd need to look at the study, and again, as I say, that might change depending on any works that are undertaken to extend the life of the current facility.
Okay, so when we come to the environmental risks, then mining the existing mining the collet itself would probably be an item to discuss on that seminar, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and that would probably of itself require some form of consent.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin.
Okay. Okay. I don't know if there are any other questions. Not see any other hands raised. The only remaining issue I wanted to cover was just really just a reminder as to how people can engage. So as we just discussed, we've got a couple more webinars coming up. We've got managing waste and environmental risk next week, together with managing emissions, which focuses on some of the climate change responses in the plan. I mentioned we've got some drop-in sessions, so St Mary's today, Grouville tomorrow, and Trinity on Saturday. You can see all of the evidence base for the island plan online. If you want to book a slot with one of the team, we'll send a link around to enable you to do that after the presentation today. And if you do want to lodge comment to the plan, please visit the consultation portal. I can see another question. I'm not sure. Is that Steph? Is that have you got your hand raised?
Hi, Kevin. Yes, thank you. Just a process question that you reminded me about as you were talking about making comments in response to the current process. Having a look at the format that's available, can I just check with you, is the team expecting all comments to be made through the form, or is it possible to submit something by email if the submission doesn't easily fit into that format?
Yeah, we will. Like I say, we will accept comments in other format. There is, I think, there's a capacity to append material through the portal. So if it doesn't fit on the in the space provided, you can append documents through the portal. But if you're having difficulty with that, we are able to accommodate other forms of submission. They just need to be made in writing to us. Is the legal requirement. We may have to come back to you and ask you for various contact details if you submit an email to us that you would have to fill out if you went through the consultation portal. But that's just part of the formality of the process.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, thanks very much for your attendance today. As I say, the webinar will be published online shortly if you wanted to go back to it or to look at any of the previous sessions. So thanks very much for your attendance, and might see you at one of the future events. Thanks very much.